When we talk about divine law, what are we really talking about? Like, what are the absolute essentials, the bare minimum for a belief system to even qualify as a divine law? If you were building that framework from scratch, what would have to be there? What are those non-negotiable elements?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and it's one that gets right to the heart of how we define and understand, religious foundations, belief systems, and even ethics. It's a question that really demands some rigorous philosophical examination, and that's what we're diving into in this deep dive today. We're going deep into the world of Joseph Alber. He's a pretty remarkable figure in medieval Jewish philosophy, and his work offers some really compelling insights into this whole question of what makes a divine law divine.
And you, our insightful listener, you've brought us this rich resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Albo. It's an incredible opportunity to really unpack how this brilliant thinker wrestled with, like, the very principles underpinning religious belief. And for someone like you, someone interested in the underlying structures of thought and how ideas evolve over time, Albo's work is a fascinating case study in how history shapes philosophy.
I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Right.
Albo wasn't just theorizing in a vacuum, he was very much a product of his time. And his attempts to define these essential principles of divine law, they're really intertwined with the specific challenges and intellectual currents of 15th century Spain.
Okay, so let's get into it. To understand Albo's project, we need to understand his world.
Right. I mean, we have to start with the basics. Joseph Albo, he lived roughly from 1380 to 1444, so we're talking about the 15th century. He was a Jewish philosopher living in Christian Spain, and that's really important to emphasize because this was a period marked by, well, frankly, significant adversity for the Jewish community.
Yeah, the sources really paint a picture of intense persecution. We're talking systemic discrimination, economic hardship, and even outright violence against Jews.
Hmm.
It just sounds like an incredibly difficult and precarious time to be a Jewish thinker.
It absolutely was. And on top of this external pressure, there were these really vigorous internal intellectual debates within the Jewish community itself. You had these sort of competing approaches to understanding faith and tradition. There was tension between, say, the rationalists who are trying to find harmony between philosophy and religious teachings, and then the more conservative perspectives that really emphasize the authority of traditional texts and mystical interpretations.
So it wasn't just the external pressures shaping Albo's work. He was also responding to these internal intellectual currents within Judaism itself. It was a really dynamic period. The sources mention that Albo played a significant role in the disputation at Tortosa. What was that all about, and what does it tell us about Albo and his context?
The disputation at Tortosa took place in 1413 and 1414, and it was basically a huge public debate, an intellectual showdown. You had Geronimo de Santa Fe, a Jewish convert to Christianity, representing the Pope, and then Albo was a key representative for the Jewish community. It was a very charged atmosphere where these fundamental questions of faith were being debated, and you can only imagine the pressure Albo must have been under.
And then in 1415, there were some, let's say, significant events that impacted Albo's community, leading him to relocate to Soria, where he eventually completed his most famous work, Sefer HaYekarim, or the Book of Principles, around 1425. This book really became his masterpiece.
And for a philosopher like you, I think what's really interesting about Sefer HaYekarim is its style. It's not just straight up abstract philosophical reasoning. Albo weaves together logic, systematic analysis, and a lot of detailed interpretation of scripture, what's called exegesis. He's really trying to create a comprehensive and integrated approach.
Okay, so we've got this philosopher operating in this context of intense pressure and intellectual ferment, and he produces this significant book. What was the fundamental question that Albo was trying to answer in Sefer HaYekarim? What was his driving intellectual pursuit?
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Albo makes it pretty clear. His central aim was to figure out, rigorously define, the essential beliefs, the core ideas that are absolutely necessary for a system to be considered a divine law. He wasn't just looking at Jewish law, he was trying to get at the essence of what makes any system of laws divinely ordained, as opposed to just being something humans came up with for practical or cultural reasons.
So a much broader focus than just Jewish law. He's aiming for this universal understanding of divine law. That's ambitious.
Exactly. And he was very consciously engaging with his intellectual predecessors. Thinkers like Maimonides had already proposed 13 principles of Jewish faith. But Albo felt like those previous attempts, while valuable, hadn't really zeroed in on the truly indispensable, the truly fundamental elements of a divine law. He wanted to go deeper and refine those ideas.
Okay, so this leads us to his broader theory of law, right? Where he moves beyond the specifics of Mosaic law to this more encompassing concept of divine law that could apply across different traditions.
Exactly. He makes this distinction between three types of law. First, you've got divine law itself, which is any system of laws that's believed to have come directly from God. Judaism being, of course, his primary example.
Okay, divine law, check. What's next?
Then you've got conventional law. This is basically the stuff that humans come up with to make society function, to keep order, ensure cooperation, that kind of thing. Think of all the different legal systems and social norms that we have across different cultures.
Right, the rules of the road, so to
Yeah,
speak.
exactly. And then the third category is natural law. These are like the fundamental moral principles that are aimed at preventing injustice, promoting ethical behavior. Interestingly, Albo does engage with this concept of natural law, and he might have been influenced by thinkers like Aquinas. But scholars generally agree that it wasn't like a central pillar in his overall framework for defining divine law.
Okay, so three categories of law, each with its own purpose and source. But the big question is, how do you determine which of these competing claims of divine origin is actually legitimate? How do you sort out the true divine law from the false ones?
That's the crux of it, especially in Albo's context, where interreligious dialogue was so prominent. And he lays out two key criteria. First, he says that the beliefs within a true divine law can't contradict any of the fundamental principles of divine law itself, which, of course, he goes on to define. So internal consistency is key. And second, there has to be undeniable proof that the messenger who delivered these laws was actually a credible source, like a genuine prophet.
It makes sense. You need both a coherent set of beliefs and a trustworthy source for those beliefs if you're going to make the claim of divine authority. The sources also bring up an interesting point made by the scholar Lasker about the role of philosophy in all of this. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Sure. You might think that, in these kinds of debates, philosophy would be used to try and prove the truth of your own religious beliefs, right? But Lasker suggests that Albo's use of philosophy is actually more about negating other viewpoints, specifically those that contradict fundamental logical principles. So, in a sense, instead of trying to prove that Judaism is true, Albo is using philosophy to point out the inconsistencies in other systems, like Christianity, to show that they can't be divine law because they don't hold up logically. It's a subtle but important distinction in his strategy.
That's a really interesting point. It's less about proving your own beliefs and more about using reason to kind of expose the weaknesses in competing claims. It's a very, I don't know, it's almost a defensive strategy in a way. Okay, so with all that said, what are Albo's core principles of divine law? What does he boil it all down to?
He gets it down to just three: existence of God, revelation, which in the context of Judaism specifically refers to the divine origin of the Torah, but the concept itself is applicable to any religion claiming divine revelation. And finally, reward and punishment, meaning that there's divine providence, like God's actively involved in the world, and that actions have consequences, justice is meted out.
Only three. That's a pretty significant reduction compared to Maimonides' 13 principles. So for Albo, these are the non-negotiables, the absolute bedrock. If you don't have these, you can't even talk about divine law.
Right. And that's what I think is so powerful about Albo's approach, especially if you're thinking about it from a philosophical perspective. He's stripping it down to the bare essentials, saying that everything else, all the other beliefs and practices, while they might be important within a specific religious tradition, they're ultimately secondary. They flow from these three core principles. And if you deny any of these, the whole thing falls apart. It's a very bold and really thought-provoking approach.
It definitely makes you think about what's truly essential to a belief system. And from these three principles, Albo then develops a more detailed structure, right? The sources mention something about roots that branch out from these principles.
Yeah, that's right. He takes these three big ideas and develops them into 8 roots, which basically provide more specific content and kind of flesh out those general principles. Think of it like the principles are the trunk of a tree, and the roots are the big, strong supports that come out from that trunk.
Okay, so let's walk through these roots. What kind of ideas branch out from the principle of the existence of God?
Well, from the existence of God, Albo gets 4 roots. First, God is one, meaning there's only one God. Second, God is incorporeal, meaning God doesn't have a physical body. Third, God is independent of time, meaning God is eternal, not bound by time. And finally, God has no imperfections, meaning God is perfect in every way.
What about the second principle, the revelation of the Torah? What are the roots there?
From Revelation, he gets 3 more roots. First, God has perfect knowledge, which is necessary for God to be able to reveal anything to us. Second, prophecy is the means by which this revelation happens. God communicates through prophets. And third, the prophet who delivers the revelation has to be authentic, genuinely appointed by God. In Judaism, this refers to Moses.
Makes sense. So we've got 7 roots so far. What about the last one? Reward and punishment. What's the root there?
This one branches into a single root, divine providence. That's the belief that God is actively involved in the world, intervening, guiding events, ensuring that justice is served and people get what they deserve.
Okay, so 8 roots in
Yeah.
total that provide a more detailed explanation of those 3 core principles. And if I remember correctly, denying any of these principles or roots is considered pretty serious, right?
Absolutely. For Albo, to deny any of these is basically heresy. It's a fundamental rejection of the very foundations of divine law. But then he introduces another layer, another category of beliefs, the branches.
Branches. Okay, how do these branches fit into the picture? What are they all about? Are they like building upon the foundation, so to speak?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. The principles are the foundation, the roots are the main support beams, and the branches are sort of like the individual rooms or parts of the house that are built on top of that structure. And the branches, for Albo, are more specific doctrines and beliefs that he thinks are true and important for people to accept, particularly within Judaism.
So what are some examples of these branches, and how are they different from the principles and roots in terms of their importance?
All right, so the branches specific to Judaism that Albo lays out are things like creation ex nihilo, which is the belief that God created the universe out of nothing. Then there's the supremacy of Moses' prophecy above all other prophets. Then the immutability of the Torah, meaning the core laws and principles can't be changed. Then the idea that a person can achieve perfection by fulfilling even just one commandment. And then, of course, belief in the resurrection of the dead and the coming of the Messiah. The key difference is that denying these branches, while it's considered a sin, something you need to atone for, it's not heresy. It doesn't mean you're rejecting divine law altogether. They're important beliefs within Judaism, but they're not the universal foundational truths that define divine law in general.
Interesting. So you could, for example, have different ideas about what happens after death, but still be within the bounds of divine law as long as you accept those 3 core principles: God, revelation, and reward and punishment.
Right, that's exactly what Albo's getting at. He's trying to create this clear hierarchy, distinguishing between what's absolutely fundamental to any divine law and what's more like a specific doctrinal belief within a particular tradition.
Now, the sources point out that most scholars agree that Albo wasn't completely original in his ideas. He was drawing on and synthesizing the work of a lot of previous Jewish philosophers. How does that influence how we understand his theory of principles?
It's a really important point. Albo wasn't working in isolation. He was deeply engaged with the ideas of thinkers like Maimonides, Crescas, and Duran. His contribution was probably more about bringing these different ideas together, creating a more systematic and concise framework than coming up with every single concept from scratch. Some scholars even suggest that the idea of formulating a theory of fundamental principles like this wasn't even Albo's original idea. It raises the question of what constitutes originality in philosophy. Is it always about coming up with brand new ideas, or can it also be about taking existing ideas and organizing and clarifying them in a new way?
That's a big question, and it speaks to how we evaluate the impact of a philosopher's work. And then there's this even more recent theory that's pretty fascinating, the idea that there might be esoteric writing within Sefer HaIkrim. What's that all about?
Okay, so this is where things get even more interesting. Some scholars have pointed out that there seem to be some inconsistencies, some apparent contradictions in Albo's writing. And this theory suggests that those might not just be oversights, but could actually be intentional. They might be a form of esoteric writing, where Albo is deliberately embedding multiple layers of meaning in his text.
Intentional contradictions. Why would he do that?
Well, the idea is that he might have been trying to conceal his true views from certain audiences, maybe people outside of the Jewish community who might use his ideas against Jews, or even people within the Jewish community who weren't ready for more, let's say, radical interpretations. He might have been trying to protect himself and his ideas. There's even a passage in the introduction to the second part of Sefer HaIkrim that some scholars point to as evidence for this theory. For example, his discussions of divine attributes, those get a little tricky. And some think that's a place where he might be subtly signaling a more unconventional view to those who know how to read between the lines.
So what looks like a contradiction on the surface might actually be a deliberate strategy to communicate different ideas to different audiences.
Exactly. It suggests that Albo was a much more subtle and strategic thinker than we might initially give him credit for. It makes us think about the different ways that a philosophical text can operate, and whether we should always take everything at face value, especially when we're dealing with someone writing in a time and place where intellectual freedom might have been limited.
Fascinating. It really adds a whole other dimension to interpreting his work. The sources also talk about Albo's dual goals in writing Sefer HaIkrim. He had a social goal and a theoretical goal. What were those?
Yeah, well, the social goal was very much tied to the historical context we talked about earlier. Alba wanted to provide a strong intellectual defense of Judaism against the pressures and criticisms it was facing, particularly from Christianity. He was trying to give the Jewish community a firm foundation to stand on, to resist conversion, and to maintain their identity in a hostile environment.
So a defensive strategy, but on an intellectual level. He was trying to arm the Jewish community with the tools to defend their faith.
Precisely. And then the theoretical goal was more internal, focused on clarifying and refining the core ideas of Judaism itself. He wanted to address those internal debates we talked about, those different schools of thought within Jewish philosophy, and provide a more streamlined and philosophically rigorous account of what it means to be Jewish.
So he was trying to strengthen Judaism, both externally, in relation to other religions, and internally, in terms of its own intellectual coherence and consistency.
Exactly. And I think the fact that Sefer HaIkrim became one of the first Jewish philosophical works to be printed really speaks to the impact it had. It became much more widely available and was studied and debated by Jewish thinkers for centuries. And it even influenced some Christian theologians and philosophers later on, like Spinoza and Mendelssohn. So it really had a lasting influence, even beyond its immediate historical context.
It's amazing to see how Albo's work, which was born out of this very specific historical and intellectual context, still has something to say to us today. It really highlights how the search for truth, for those fundamental principles that guide our beliefs, is a timeless pursuit. And makes me wonder, if we were to try and define those essential principles for ourselves, not just in terms of divine law, but even for a broader ethical framework, what would those non-negotiables be, and how would we go about defending them, justifying them, in a world where there are so many different perspectives and beliefs?
I think that's a question that all of us, not just philosophers, grapple with. Albo gives us a model, a framework for thinking about these questions, and his work is still incredibly relevant and thought-provoking, even centuries later.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about. What an amazing deep dive.
I agree. It's been a pleasure exploring Albo's ideas with you.
Thanks to you, our listener, for bringing us this fascinating topic. Until next time.